300 feet beneath the Atlantic Ocean, the USS Leviathan sat motionless in the crushing darkness. What should have been the Navy's most advanced nuclear submarine had become a $60 billion paperweight, its revolutionary reactor systems completely dead. In the cramped control room, Captain Williams stared at the emergency lighting, casting eerie shadows across the faces of his crew, 98 souls, depending on life support systems that wouldn't last another 12 hours. The submarine's maiden voyage had started with such promise. State-of-the-art technology, the finest engineers money could buy, and a reactor design that promised to revolutionize underwater warfare. But now, after 6 hours of desperate attempts by the Navy's top nuclear technicians, the Leviathan remained as lifeless as a beached whale. "Sir," Lieutenant Commander Torres approached with obvious reluctance, "Admiral Harrison is on the emergency communication line. He wants a full status report." Williams picked up the secure phone, his voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. "Admiral, we've tried everything. The primary cooling system is locked up, backup generators are failing, and we're looking at complete life support failure within hours. The reactor won't respond to any of our standard protocols." Before continuing, give us a like and subscribe to discover more stories of unsung heroes whose quiet expertise saves the day when everything else fails. On the surface, Admiral Harrison stood in the Pentagon's crisis room, surrounded by maps, monitors, and increasingly desperate officials. The weight of command had never felt heavier. 98 lives hung in the balance, not to mention the potential international incident if a nuclear submarine was lost in international waters. "Admiral," his aide whispered urgently, "the Chief of Naval Operations wants options." "Now." Harrison closed his eyes, thinking of every resource at his disposal. The Navy's best nuclear engineers were already on site. The submarine's computer systems showed no obvious malfunctions. Everything looked perfect on paper, yet nothing worked in reality. Then, almost like a whisper from his past, Harrison remembered a conversation from 15 years ago. A gruff voice telling him, "Admiral, computers are fine, but sometimes you need someone who can feel what the machine is telling you." That voice belonged to Frank Morrison, a 67-year-old mechanic who had spent 45 years working on submarines. Not the flashy nuclear-powered ones that made headlines, but the older diesel submarines that had served faithfully through decades of service. Frank had retired 5 years ago to a small workshop in Norfolk, Virginia, where he restored classic motorcycles and occasionally helped young sailors understand the basics of mechanical systems. The Navy brass had always considered Frank outdated. His methods seemed primitive compared to computer diagnostics and digital monitoring systems. He worked by sound, by touch, by instinct developed over decades of coaxing life from stubborn machinery. While younger technicians relied on readouts and protocols, Frank would place his weathered hand on an engine block and somehow know exactly what was wrong. "Get me Frank Morrison," Harrison said suddenly, surprising everyone in the room. "Sir," his aide looked confused. "The submarine mechanic who retired. Admiral, this is a nuclear reactor we're talking about, not some old diesel engine." Harrison's jaw tightened with determination. "That old diesel mechanic understands machines in ways our computer experts never will. If anyone can figure out why a perfectly good reactor won't start, it's Frank Morrison." Within minutes, a military helicopter was racing toward Norfolk. Time was running out for the crew of the Leviathan, but Harrison had learned long ago that sometimes the most sophisticated problems require the simplest solutions, and sometimes the most unlikely heroes are exactly what desperate situations demand. Frank Morrison was elbow deep in the engine of a 1947 Harley-Davidson when the military helicopter's rotors began thundering overhead. He didn't look up immediately. 45 years of submarine service had taught him that panic never fixed anything. His weathered hands continued their methodical work, feeling for the subtle vibration that would tell him if the timing was right. The helicopter landed in the field behind his workshop, kicking up clouds of Virginia dust. Through his oil-stained windows, Frank watched uniformed officers stride toward his door with the urgency he remembered from countless emergency calls during his Navy career. "Mr. Morrison," the young lieutenant's voice carried barely controlled desperation. "Admiral Harrison needs you immediately. There's a submarine emergency." Frank slowly wiped his hands on a shop rag, his gray eyes taking in the officer's tense posture. "Son, I've been retired for 5 years. The Navy's got plenty of younger, smarter folks who understand all that computer nonsense better than this old salt. Sir, the USS Leviathan's nuclear reactor is completely dead. 98 crew members are running out of time, and nothing our technicians try is working." At the mention of lives at stake, Frank's entire demeanor shifted. The casual retirement attitude vanished, replaced by the focused intensity that had made him legendary among submariners. "How long do they have?" "Less than 8 hours on life support." Frank was already reaching for his old toolkit, a battered metal box that had followed him through decades of underwater crises. "Tell the Admiral I'll need complete schematics and a direct comm line to their engineering team." During the helicopter flight to Naval Station Norfolk, Frank studied the Leviathan's blueprints on a tablet computer. The young technician beside him explained the situation with growing frustration. "Mr. Morrison, we've run every diagnostic protocol 3 times. The reactor systems are perfect pressure levels, cooling circuits, control rod positioning, everything shows normal. But it won't start. It's like the heart is there, but there's no pulse." Frank's weathered finger traced the cooling system layout, his mind processing information in ways that had nothing to do with computer algorithms. "Tell me about the sounds." "Sounds? When they try to start her up, what does she sound like?" The technician looked confused. "Well, the pumps engage, but there's this clicking. Like something's trying to catch, but can't." Frank nodded slowly. In his experience, machines always told you what was wrong, you just had to know how to listen. And the vibration patterns in the cooling pipes. "Aye. We don't really monitor those manually anymore, sir. The computers handle all that." "Computers don't have ears, son. They can't feel what the metal is trying to tell them." At the naval base, Frank was rushed into a secure communication room where Admiral Harrison's voice crackled through encrypted channels. "Frank, thank God. We've got the Navy's best nuclear engineers on site, but they're stumped. The reactor looks perfect on every readout. Admiral, patch me through to whoever's closest to the primary cooling intake." Minutes later, Frank was speaking directly to Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez in the Leviathan's engine room. "Chief, I need you to put your hand on the main coolant line, about 2 feet from where it enters the reactor housing." "Sir, my instruments show normal pressure and temperature." "Forget the instruments for a minute. Just touch the pipe and tell me what you feel." There was a pause, then Rodriguez's voice returned with surprise. "It feels wrong, like there's a flutter, almost like a heartbeat that keeps skipping." Frank smiled for the first time since hearing about the crisis. After 45 years of listening to submarines, he was beginning to understand what the Leviathan was trying to say. The problem wasn't in the reactor itself. It was something far simpler and potentially far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. "Chief Rodriguez, I need you to follow that coolant line backward toward the intake valve." Frank's voice carried the calm authority of someone who had talked crews through countless crises. "Tell me about every connection, every joint, every place where that line changes direction." Deep in the Leviathan's engine room, Rodriguez traced the massive coolant pipes with his flashlight, his free hand maintaining contact with the metal. Around him, the Navy's top nuclear technicians watched skeptically as the retired diesel mechanic guided their investigation from hundreds of miles away. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Sarah Chen, the submarine's chief nuclear engineer, interrupted with barely concealed impatience. "With respect, we've tested every component in this cooling system. The issue has to be in the reactor control software or the automated monitoring systems." Frank's weathered voice came through the speakers with gentle firmness. "Doctor, I've been fixing submarines since before you were born. Sometimes the smartest computers miss the simplest problems. Chief, what do you feel now?" Rodriguez had reached a section where the main coolant line split into 3 smaller pipes. "Sir, there's definitely something wrong here. The vibration is stronger, and I can hear. It sounds like marbles rolling around inside the pipe." Every technician in the room froze. Marbles rolling in a coolant line could only mean one thing: debris in the system. But how could debris get into a brand-new, sealed nuclear cooling system? "Chief, very carefully now, I want you to check the intake filter housing. Don't remove anything yet. Just tell me if there's any way to see inside." Frank's mind was racing through possibilities. 45 years of submarine maintenance had taught him that the most catastrophic failures often had the most mundane causes. A forgotten wrench, a loose bolt, even construction debris left behind during installation. Any of these could disable the most sophisticated machinery ever built. "There's a viewing port on the filter housing," Rodriguez reported, his voice tight with concentration. "Shining my light in, Jesus Christ." "What do you see, Chief?" "Metal shavings, sir, lots of them. They're packed against the intake filter like a solid wall." The engine room erupted in urgent conversations. Dr. Chen was already calculating how metal debris could have contaminated a supposedly pristine system. The other technicians began frantically checking their construction records and quality control reports, but Frank's voice cut through the chaos with calm precision. "Chief, listen carefully. That debris is blocking your coolant flow, which is why the reactor can't maintain proper temperature regulation. But we can't just flush it out. Those metal shavings could damage the reactor core if they get through." "What do we do?" Captain Williams' voice joined the conversation from the control room. Frank closed his eyes, visualizing the submarine's layout from memory. There should be a manual bypass valve, probably painted red, somewhere near the main filter housing. "Chief, do you see it?" "Yes, sir, but the manual says it's only for emergency use during construction." "Son, 98 lives constitute an emergency, but we're going to do this very, very carefully." Over the next 20 minutes, Frank guided the crew through a procedure that existed in no technical manual. Using his decades of experience with hydraulic systems, he had Rodriguez partially open the bypass valve while simultaneously creating a controlled backflow that would trap the metal debris in a collection chamber. "The key," Frank explained to the fascinated technicians, "is understanding that these systems are like living things. You can't force them, you have to coax them, feel what they're telling you, and respond with the right touch." Dr. Chen watched in amazement as the temperature readings began to stabilize. "How did you know about the bypass procedure? It's not in any of our operational manuals." Frank chuckled softly. "Because 40 years ago, I was the old salt who taught the engineers who wrote those manuals. Sometimes the most important knowledge doesn't make it into the official books." As the Leviathan systems began humming back to life, Captain Williams felt the submarine's emergency lighting switch back to normal power. The gentle vibration of a properly functioning reactor filled the hull, a sound as beautiful as any symphony to the trapped crew. But Frank wasn't finished yet. The debris had been contained, but they still needed to understand how it got there in the first place. As the USS Leviathan's reactor hummed back to life, Frank Morrison wasn't celebrating yet. 4 decades of submarine maintenance had taught him that solving the immediate problem was only half the battle. Understanding how the problem occurred was crucial for preventing future disasters. "Chief Rodriguez," Frank's voice remained focused despite the obvious relief throughout the submarine, "I need you to carefully remove that debris from the collection chamber. Don't let any of it wash away. We need to examine every piece." Dr. Chen coordinated with the surface team to analyze the metal shavings Rodriguez carefully extracted. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the entire naval command structure. "Mr. Morrison," Admiral Harrison's voice was grim as he reviewed the initial analysis, "the debris consists of aluminum shavings mixed with steel particles. The composition matches components used in the reactor assembly process, but here's the disturbing part. Some of these shavings show signs of deliberate cutting, not accidental wear. Frank absorbed this information with the steady calm of someone who had seen both human error and human malice damage critical systems. Admiral, how many people had access to the cooling system during construction? We're reviewing the records now, but we're talking about dozens of contractors, technicians, and oversight personnel over an 18-month construction period. In the Leviathan's engine room, Chief Rodriguez made another troubling discovery. Mr. Morrison, there's something else here. It looks like a small tool, maybe a drill bit wedged behind the main filter housing. Dr. Chen examined the drill bit under magnification. This was placed deliberately. The position would have slowly worked metal shavings loose every time the cooling pumps engaged, but the debris would have taken weeks to accumulate enough to cause a complete blockage. The implications were staggering. Someone had sabotaged the Navy's most advanced submarine using nothing more than a few metal shavings and a strategically placed drill bit. The sabotage was designed to cause catastrophic failure, but only after the submarine was far from port with a full crew aboard. Frank's mind worked through the technical aspects while Admiral Harrison coordinated with naval intelligence to investigate the human factors. Doctor, whoever did this understood these systems intimately. They knew exactly how to create a delayed failure that would look like a random malfunction. But they didn't count on someone like you, Rodriguez interjected with obvious admiration. Our computer diagnostics would have never detected this. The debris buildup was too gradual, and the symptoms looked like a dozen other possible problems. Frank's weathered hands traced the submarine schematics one more time. The real lesson here isn't about my experience, it's about the danger of relying too heavily on automated systems. Machines can lie, computers can be fooled, but 45 years of working with my hands taught me that metal doesn't lie. It always tells the truth about what's happening to it. As the investigation continued, naval intelligence began focusing on a specific contractor who had been terminated during construction for security violations. James Fletcher, a former submarine technician with gambling debts and connections to foreign intelligence services, had maintained access to restricted areas for weeks after his official termination. Fletcher knew these systems as well as anyone, Admiral Harrison reported to the crisis team. He had the knowledge to plan this sabotage and the desperation to carry it out. We're issuing warrants now, but Frank was already thinking beyond the immediate crisis. Admiral, this submarine needs to surface immediately for a complete inspection. If Fletcher sabotaged the cooling system, he might have compromised other critical components as well. Dr. Chen ran quick calculations on the submarine's current status. We're stable enough to reach the surface, but Mr. Morrison is right. We need a full forensic examination of every system Fletcher had access to. As the Leviathan began its emergency ascent, Frank finally allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. 98 lives had been saved, not by the Navy's most sophisticated technology, but by the simple wisdom of understanding that machines, like people, always tell you what's wrong if you know how to listen. The real hero of this crisis wasn't the advanced reactor or the computer diagnostics, but the accumulated knowledge of a man who had spent his life learning to hear what machines were trying to say. 6 months after the USS Leviathan incident, Frank Morrison stood in a Pentagon conference room filled with the Navy's highest-ranking officials. The investigation had concluded with James Fletcher's arrest and conviction for sabotage, but the implications of the case had fundamentally changed how the Navy approached submarine maintenance. Admiral Harrison opened the briefing with characteristic directness. Gentlemen, the Leviathan crisis exposed critical vulnerabilities in our over-reliance on automated diagnostic systems. Mr. Morrison's intervention saved 98 lives and prevented what could have been the worst submarine disaster in naval history. Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair. At 67, He had never sought recognition, just the satisfaction of fixing things that were broken. But the room full of admirals and engineers hung on his every word as he explained the fundamental principles that had guided his career. "The problem isn't with technology," Frank said, his weathered hands gesturing toward the complex submarine schematics displayed on the conference room screens. "The problem is when we forget that technology serves us, not the other way around. Every machine has a voice, vibrations, sounds, temperatures that tell you what's happening inside. But if you only listen to computers, you miss half the conversation." Dr. Chen, who had been promoted to head of submarine maintenance protocols following the incident, presented the new training programs being implemented fleet-wide. "We're now requiring all nuclear technicians to complete hands-on diagnostic training with experienced mechanics like Mr. Morrison. Computer analysis remains important, but we're also teaching our people to use their senses and intuition." The changes went far beyond training programs. The Navy was retrofitting existing submarines with additional manual monitoring points that would allow experienced technicians to physically assess critical systems. New construction protocols included multiple inspection phases by veteran mechanics who could identify potential problems that might not show up in digital diagnostics. "Mr. Morrison," Admiral Harrison continued, "we'd like you to head up the new Veteran Expertise Integration Program. Your job would be to train a new generation of submarine mechanics while ensuring we never lose the practical knowledge that saved the Leviathan." Frank considered the offer carefully. Retirement had been peaceful, working on classic motorcycles and enjoying the quiet satisfaction of fixing things without the pressure of life-or-death situations. But the memory of 98 souls trapped beneath the ocean, depending on his ability to interpret what their submarine was trying to tell them, made the decision clear. "Admiral, I'll do it on one condition. These young technicians need to understand that the most sophisticated machine ever built is still just metal and moving parts. If they can learn to listen, really listen, to what the machinery is telling them, they'll be better submarine mechanics than any computer program ever created." Chief Rodriguez, who had been promoted and assigned to the new training program, smiled as he remembered the gentle voice that had guided him through the crisis. "Mr. Morrison taught us that sometimes the most powerful engines need the gentlest touch." As the meeting concluded, Frank reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. From a young mechanic learning his trade on diesel submarines to the man whose intuition saved the Navy's most advanced nuclear vessel. The technology had changed dramatically over his career, but the fundamental truth remained constant. Machines, like people, responded better to understanding than to force. The Leviathan incident had become a turning point for naval engineering, proving that the wisdom of experience could never be fully replaced by the efficiency of automation. In submarine